Welcome you all to Trek Wars. Welcome to Trek Wars, and on today's episode, we're going to be evaluating Starship evolution. We're going to be talking about the different designs Starfleet had, why they had it, why they did it, what kind of materials were on board, what kind of technology was being used, and the general effect it had on the Federation itself. All right, and to start from the very beginning, before Starfleet was even formed, there was the Earth Alliance forces and their original designs. So these designs are based off submarines. They're very simple, not really a whole lot of complexity into these starships. They're short-range sensors. They use very primitive weapons such as particle beams, nuclear missiles, maybe possibly laser cannons on some of them, and actual space torpedoes. Now, they're not using photon torpedoes. They're actually using torpedoes in space. Very, very simple designs. So one of the things to note about these ships is when it comes to actual sizes, these ships are relatively large starships, and they are that way because they are so slow. They need lots of food for their crew. Now, there's a lot of civilian variants of this, there's military variants of this, but the one thing I want to take the most is these ships are very slow, very, very, very slow. These are like literally bricks in space. These are the ships that were used during the first encounters and first war with the Romulan Star Empire. All right, so at the onset of the war with the Romulans, Starfleet did have more advanced starships, and this would have been the NX line. Now, the NX line of starships were very different than the previous variant. They had polarized hull armor, they had lasers, and they also had more advanced space torpedoes. Overall, the ship was capable of going to about warp 4, and later on the variants could go up to warp 5. But just understand, these ships were capable of deep space exploration, and they're the beginning stages of good defensive capabilities. Now, these ships are capable of holding their own against more modern starships of the time period. I wouldn't say they're superior, but they're at least maybe a slightly below the average ship out there. So the Romulan technology of this time period is actually inferior than most of the other races out there. And so ships of the line like this would be considered basically a cruiser at this point, and they would have been maybe even considered a heavy cruiser when it comes to a military perspective. But they had the ability to engage enemies at deep space. So when you start to see the beginnings of these circular designs for the nacelles, just understand that these are getting to the point where we're getting towards modern warp capabilities. They cannot actually truly make it to what we would consider modern warp capabilities, but they're getting very close. Now, the NX line of starships are the most advanced starships of this time period, but what's more relevant is the next generation of starships. So, the next generation of starships is ships like the Daedalus. So, ships like this, the Daedalus, the reason why this ship is so important and why it has more of an impact than an NX version class starships is the fact that this ship can be produced in mass production. So it's a hybrid between common technology and more sophisticated technology seen on the NX. But unlike the NX line of starships, which at the time period are the most advanced ships that they can produce and are very time consuming, this is the first time that a mass production model goes into production that not only Earth Alliance is building, but other races are building for the Earth Alliance for the war with the Romulans. So this ship is more impactful to the Federation because it's the first time they decided to come together to build a single starship. So the next evolution is the Baton Rouge class starships. Now, these are using particle beam cannons, nuclear missiles, and they're using laser cannons and also space torpedoes just like the previous ships. What make these ships stand out from the previous generation of the NX classes is these are the first generation of starships that are starting to use shields. Now, they're a very, very poor shield, but nonetheless, it's an actual shield. Now, the other thing that makes this ship unique is it's capable of warp 6. So, this is the first generation of true deep space modern explorers. So, if you are only capable of warp 1 and warp 2, you're not really capable of deep space exploration. If you're capable of going anywhere between warp 4 and warp 5, you're getting to the point where you can go into deep space, but it's not really considered deep space exploration until you hit the mark of warp 6. Warp 6 is the factor that means that you are absolutely deep space capable and you are modern Starship. So the best thing about this ship is the Barton Rogue is basically all the previous technologies put into one. It's got newer, faster engines. It's capable of warp 6. It has the weaponry that the previous generation has, but most importantly, it can be built in mass. So this ship, for its time period, was a relatively heavily armed starship. It would be considered a heavy cruiser. Now, by the time we get to Captain Kirk era, the ship has been dedicated to a light cruiser. But the design was so successful and so good, it was kept around for a very long time. Now, with that being said, we're going to move on to the next design. So there are two really important aspects of the next generation of designs. So first off, we're going to see the Constitution class, and we're going to see the rounded warp nacelles, and we're going to see much higher levels of warp speed with the next generations of starships. The next generation of starships we're looking at, I'm going to call the Kirk era, are extremely more advanced than the previous ships. So, Kirk era generation, the rounded warp nacelles, their ships are typically able to cruise at warp 4. They have a max safe speed of warp 6, and they have an emergency of warp 8. So, this means that these ships are modern starships, and more importantly than that, these ships are using phaser technology instead of the particle beams and laser cannons of the previous generation. And they're no longer using nuclear missiles or space torpedoes. They're now using photon torpedo tube. Now, besides that, the other thing that makes the ships really relevant is that the long range and short range tracking systems and sensor systems aboard these ships are magnitudes level higher than the previous generation of starships. The other thing that makes this time period very notable is the fact that they have advancements in technology and warp stability that they're capable of using one nacelle to propel a starship. Now that doesn't seem like very relevant, but when you look at the production and how expensive a ship is to construct in this time period, how much time it takes to construct one of these starships, you realize that one nacelle designs are very optimal because most of the cost or time a starship takes is in the warp nacelle itself. It's by far the most expensive or hardest part to construct and build. Now, it's even more harder and more important than the warp core itself. The warp nacelles is what is giving this ship the abilities for deep space combat and everything else. Now, I will note that these ships, once they do go past warp 6, they do have a tendency, one single design warp nacelles, to fall out of warp. Now, that's not really an extremely big problem when you're just exploring, but when you're in a combat situation, that can mean life or death. So anything that has a warp nacelle that looks like the Enterprise from the movies, that's a Rift class generation. And so there are advancements in technology in all avenues during this time period, but they're not as dramatic as one would think. So the sensor systems are better, the weapon systems are better, the engines are better, the warp cores are better. Everything has got a significant increase. Ships of this time period are also experimenting with designs. So this is the time period when Starfleet goes into like just experimenting with all kinds of different designs, which you really didn't see too much of in the previous generations. But there are so many Federation Rift class starships, it would literally take me an hour to go through them all. If you've seen some of my series talking about some of the different class Rift class starships, just destroyers alone, there's like a dozen. So warp speeds don't really increase very much. Ships are pretty similar to the previous generation. The only real difference is the fact that previously, if you had 3 engines, 4 engines, or 1 engine, your warp stability was significantly damaged by having those non-2 warp nacelles. So if you had 2 warp nacelles, you had a very stable warp field. If you had 3, it was unstable. If you had 1, it was also unstable. Those warp dynamic issues don't exist with the newer generation of starships, and also the Rift generation starships. There are several ships that are ridiculously fast because they were able to integrate 3 and 4 warp nacelles safely. Now, another thing to take note is the propulsion systems. They do get an increase. It's not dramatic, but the cruisers and battleships and dreadnoughts are faster than the previous generations. One of the things they did change, though, is the way the warp engines work. So the warp engines or the warp nacelles actually increase the energy output of a starship. That really isn't really a thing anymore when it comes to the Rift generation. The Rift generation warp cores are stronger than the previous generation. It's just not a whole magnitude higher. It is better. Now, the way the warp core works with the engines and the weapon systems does change from the original variants to the Rift generation, which we'll take a look next. So, with that being said, there are advancements that are being made. So, for an example, the Type 7 phaser emitters that are used on basically every single ship in this Rift generation, they're actually connected directly to the warp core itself. So, this means that they can fire more often, they can charge faster, and this also leads to advancements in technology like mega phasers. Now, I don't think this is a huge increase. It's not really the most dramatic thing because we know that Klingon ships had heavy disruptors in the Kirk era, and this is honestly is just kind of the Federation catching up to the Klingons when it comes to like weapons. So it's definitely an increase, but it's not as dramatic as you would think. Now there are some changes for dreadnoughts. So dreadnoughts aren't as slow as they used to be in the previous generation, so obviously our impulse speeds have increased. It's not dramatic, but at least the ships can maneuver at a cruiser level typically. So in this generation, shuttlecrafts are a relevant weapon and are used, and there are more shuttles on these starships than any other generation. There are carriers, light carriers, heavy carriers, and fighters are a thing, as well as bombers. Now, this is the only generation that this really exists in, and it's unique to the Rift generation starships. Now, the last thing to talk about is shielding. So, the actual physical strength of shielding does increase, but not by a huge factor. But what does happen is ships in this generation can modify their shielding to hold off certain radiation or certain kind of weapons like plasma torpedoes much better than any of the previous generations. So the Kirk generation, basically your shields were your shields, and once they go down, they go down. You really couldn't modify them, but the shield modification abilities started off in the Rift generation, and it allowed them to adjust their shield frequencies for different kinds of anomalies and radiation, and it made it so Rift generation starships could go places and have a stable warp field, which they didn't have in previous generation. So that's a huge factor, and I just wanted to share that with you guys because that means that they can go their speed is about the same, but their ability to go to other places they couldn't go to before had increased. So that's a pretty big factor in the Rift generation of technology. So the next generation is the Excelsior generation. They have their own look, their own Excelsior warp nacelles, and there were a lot of different ships. There are cruisers, battleships, dreadnoughts, carriers, everything that you've seen in the previous variant. There's at least one Excelsior variant. Now, what this makes it unique is, as far as the actual shielding goes, these ships are pretty similar in shielding to the Rift generation. But when it comes to firepower, these ships are almost 2 or 3 times as powerful as the previous generations. They carry many more shuttles. They're bigger. And the thing that really stands out about these ships is they have the firepower, they have the hull strength, they're huge. They're basically dreadnoughts. So the Rift generation, a ship like this in the Rift generation would have been a dreadnought. But this is just a standard cruiser now. So Federation ships and designs have gotten so big and so powerful during this time period that what would be considered a dreadnought or a battleship to most races is a standard cruiser now to the Federation. Now, not only is this ship huge and fast, the actual warp dynamics of this ship are so beyond other ships, it's not even funny. This ship's warp speed is something like warp 14 versus warp 8 on previous starships at their absolute max. So the warp scaling of ships in general had to change because of the advancements in warp technology from this generation of starships. Now, one of the biggest changes is the power that you're getting from your impulse engines. So the impulse capabilities of a Excelsior class variants are really good. So most of the ships in the time period that were of this size were basically moving bricks, but not the Excelsior. It was just as nimble as a cruiser from the previous generation. That is extraordinarily good stats. So it's got speed, it's got firepower, it's got shielding. So structural integrity fields have been increased, and also shielding has been increased. And when I say shielding has been increased, now I would say in Excelsior class starship, now its shielding is going to be equivalent to what you see from a Constitution Rift class. It's going to be similar, and it's not going to have as strong as a refreshment rate, but the fact is that your shield bubble can actually go around a ship of that caliber is what's extraordinary, because ships did not get that large, because the larger your ship got, the larger the bubble has to be and the weaker the bubble gets. So there's like limits to the shielding bubble and how large it gets. You start to see significant changes in shielding. Like shielding gets better at this point in time. Now it's not, if all the categories that change, this one is the one that changes the least. It gets better, but it's not a drastic level. Now, the Excelsior and the Excelsior variants do have the ability to be upgraded, and they do get upgraded to have Type 8 phaser emitters, making them the most powerful ships in the quadrant. So at that time period, that technology made these ships were even more deadly than they already were. And then another thing to note is that these starships were more modular. So what that means is these ships were built with the idea that you could upgrade them. This came from the Klingons when they built the Katanga class. The Katanga class, as soon as new technology comes, they can just swap it out. So the Excelsior variant is the first of Starfleet ships that were built that could be easily upgraded. Now, the next generation of starships is the Ambassador class, and then basically everything that you knew about Starfleet kind of goes out the door, and there's a complete change with ideas about starships. So, this ship is built for almost the sole purpose of extreme deep space exploration, right? Now, they were aware of how dangerous being in outer space is by itself, and they built a brand new weapon system called phaser arrays. So this is the first ship to use phaser arrays. Torpedo technology on this ship has been upgraded. The ship's size is enormous. This thing blows everything out of the water that previously had come out. It's very maneuverable for a ship of its size. Its shielding is astronomically high for a ship of this time period. And there is no ship really out there that any of the races has that even compares to the Ambassador class during this time period. The Ambassador class is so powerful, so overwhelming, that it would take 3 of the best ships that the other races have to even compete against the Ambassador class. So the Ambassador class, it's not really built for war, to be honest, but the ship is so advanced compared to other races that it seems like it. So instead of duotronic computer core systems, it has isolinear core systems, which means the computing power of this ship is astronomically better than the previous generation. So overall, the largest enhancements are to the phaser array system and then the computer core system. So the warp speed is relatively the same as an Excelsior, but the fact that this ship can travel at those speeds, being as large as it is, the fact this is maneuverable as it is, goes to show you that obviously the impulse technology has dramatically increased as well. Now, this ship's armor is better than any of the other previous generation starships. It can really take a beating. The ship is built to last. So next is the modern starships. These are the Lost Era classes. There's not a whole lot about these ships. They're not particularly great. There's advancements in weaponry and shielding, but for the most part, these ships are pretty subpar. This is during the time period when the Starfleet is kind of almost stagnating. And these ships have like women and children aboard. Starfleet hasn't really been in any fights. They're more built on exploration. So during this time period of the Lost Era, they're really not combat-oriented ships anymore. These ships are designed for deep space exploration with families aboard. So the only thing I say about these ships are about medium-sized class starships. They're not huge like the Ambassador class. They're more of going back to standard sizes seen during the Rift class generation. They're not really that big of starships. They're being produced in pretty decent numbers, and the reason that these generation of Lost Era is being built is to supplement the aging fleet of the Rift. So they're starting to build these smaller ships because they want to start replacing those ships that were in the Rift generation that are too old and too hard to upgrade. Now, the next generation, I'm just going to refer to as the Galaxy generation. So these are ships that are built with the Galaxy class technology. Everything about these ships is state-of-the-art. The computer cores, the amenities aboard the ship, the phaser array systems, the photon torpedo technology. Everything that these ships has is state-of-the-art. They're extremely expensive to produce, but they're very good ships. And they range from being relatively small like a frigate to a cruiser size all the way up to a battleship size like the Galaxy class. These ships are some of the most advanced starships that the Federation has, and even during the Dominion War, these ships would still be state-of-the-art. All right, so the next generation we're looking at is the anti-Borg fleets. We know the Federation was attacked by the Borg. They took heavy losses, and so they wanted to build warships to defend themselves, and that's where the Akira, the Defiant, the Sovereign, Saber, all these ships of that generation came from. Typically, these ships are relatively small. Most of the ships are pretty small from this generation, except for the Akira and the Sovereign. But they are all using very sophisticated weapon systems, and they have very sophisticated shields. Now, their sensor systems for some of the ships are a little lacking compared to the Galaxy class generation, and that's because they're built for war. They're not built for exploration. So the largest advancements is obviously regenerative shields are introduced. We have ablative armor is introduced. We have pulse phaser technology, which is introduced. There's also quantum torpedoes. There's just a large array of weapon systems and defensive systems that were brought in as a necessity. A lot of these ships were destroyed during the Dominion War. They were very effective. Most of these ships can take on 2 or 3 ships of similar race on their own. They're some of the most advanced ships of the Alpha Quadrant powers, and they're all around fantastic ships. All right, so the next generation of ships is a huge step down, and this is the junk ships. I really don't know what you want to call them or really how to explain them, but these are all the kit bash starships that exist in the Dominion War towards the end. So Starfleet had suffered so many losses that they needed ships, but they didn't have time to build the more advanced starships that they had. So they just started building ships from junkyards and putting ships together. And that's where you get this weird collage of bizarre ships. So overall, their performance value is relatively low. So there's nothing really impressive about any of the junk ships. They just were created to fit a niche. Starfleet needed ships and bodies, and they were there. These ships are pretty easy to produce, pretty easy to put together. Their performance level is probably like a mid-level cruiser at best. So although these ships, a lot of them are using Rift generation looking in tech and parts, they're actually been upgraded to have at least lost era technology. So we're talking about most of these ships are somewhere around Type 9 phaser emitters, or somewhere around there, or they have phaser arrays systems. They'll be a Type 7. So that means that they're like a blend between the Lost Era and Ambasta era type technology. So it's older technology, but it's not terrible technology. When I think about these starships, I mean, when you're in a situation like it, they're better than nothing. So that's really the best I could say about these things. Well, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I know I had a lot of fun spending time watching this and researching it and letting you guys have this information. I tried to keep it as simple as possible and give you some simple explanations of why certain ships look the way they do and the technology investment that took place between all the way going back from the NX classes to, the modern Dominion War. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Now, question is, if you don't mind giving me a like, I'd really appreciate that. And then if you would like to make a comment, I'd be really curious, is there a ship that should have been on this list that I missed? And what is that ship, and what did it do, and why would it be relevant? Give me a comment. I appreciate it. And with that being said, thank you all for hanging out with Trek Wars. I'm out. Thank you for watching Trek Wars. If you like this material, please subscribe and make a comment. And with that being said, victory is life.